Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Riddell. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Equity and Inclusion here at Victoria University. I'm an N1 man from northern New South Wales, and I'd like today to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd also like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. Wurundjeri people have been stewards of this land for tens of thousands of years, and their deep connection to country and culture is an integral part of Australia's heritage. As we convene today, let us take a moment to reflect on the wisdom of the Wurundjeri people and express gratitude for their ongoing custodianship of this land. May we carry the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration with us, recognising the importance of learning with and from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on our journey towards understanding and unity. Thank you, and may this gathering be conducted in the utmost respect on the lands of the Wurundjeri people today. May I take a few minutes and share with you that when I undertook my PhD at ANU in the area of diffusion theories, particularly focusing on the uptake of information and communication technologies in Aboriginal households, that I did not consider the ubiquitousness of digital technologies into the future and the challenges that they may bring. Enjoy the forum, and I look forward to hearing how it goes today. Thank you.
Five, four.
Thank you, Peter, for that very special acknowledgement of country, and welcome everyone to the 8th National Sport Integrity Forum, Betting Your Bottom Dollar Against the Odds. Hello, my name's Chris Nash. I'm the Managing Director of Sports Cover, and Sports Cover is very proud to be working with Victoria University. Most people here would be aware that they're ranked number 9 globally for sports science education, and together we've actually implemented 7 highly successful national sport integrity forums, and really looking forward to getting this one underway today. These forums have been a valuable tool and created a wonderful platform in addressing the most pressing issues within the sports industry. As of this morning, we had over 190 registered participants hailing from all across the country. Our attendees have included a cross-section of sports, government, administration, media, and also a number of students, I guess, who are going to now be the next generation of sports leaders. So I'd like to officially extend a very special warm welcome to my fellow Sports Cover staff, members of the VU Council, academics and researchers, Paul Oliver, AG, Deputy CEO, Corporate, Sports Integrity Australia, and his colleagues from Sports Integrity Australia, Sean Carroll, the Racing Integrity Commissioner for the Victorian Government, Anne-Marie Harrison, CEO of the Victorian Institute of Sport, Lisa Hasker, the CEO of Vic Sport, Rob Bradley, the CEO of the Confederation of Australian Sport, and Adrienne Sarkozy, the CEO of the Sport Australia Hall of Fame, and her colleagues and board members from SAHOF. Very excited to hear what the panelists have put together and the questions they're going to be answering. But as always, for those who are familiar face will be leading us today, and I'd like to introduce Professor Hans Vesterbeek from Victoria University, who's going to provide us the overview of betting your bottom dollar against the odds. Over to you, Hans.
Thank you very much, Chris. And indeed, I echo your excitement. The 8th National Sport Integrity Forum. I can't believe we're up to that number already. And I'm not sure my video. There you go. Oh, there's always technical issues. So we get that out of the way. Thank you very much, by the way, Chris, also for your ongoing support ever since we started the National Sports Integrity Forum almost a decade ago. This forum, as it was last year, online for a number of efficiency and reach reasons. We obviously provide much more flexibility for people to attend. also for those in different cities around the country, and even for those who tune in from overseas, now live, but also later in the recorded version of the forum that will be made available to all of you, by the way, as well. For those of you online keen to engage, there's definitely a wonderful opportunity to use the Q&A function via Vimeo, where you can lodge your questions that will be moderated by our wonderful staff, and the questions that turn out to be more prevalent than others will be fed to us for later audience engagement with the panel. I will feed those questions to our esteemed panel. As noted, a link to the event will be sent to all registered participants, but by all means feel free to relay or redistribute that link to those of whom you think might be interested in reliving the forum and getting some benefits from it after the live event. Now, as we do every year, and not by coincidence, we obviously cultivate and nurture a topic that is very high on the priority list of many organizations, not exclusively to sports organizations, but all of those in the sport business ecosystem. And this year, it might not be a big surprise that gambling in sport, wagering sport, betting on sport, and all the related issues, some opportunities, many challenges that need to be considered by all of us in the sport ecosystem. We have put together and invited a panel that allows us to look at various issues from multiple angles, from multiple perspectives, levels of expertise, experience, and roles that our panelists play in their organizations and in the bigger sport ecosystem, specifically related to betting. But allow me a couple of minutes to maybe set the scene for all of us to if not already, better understand what has led to the fact that we are now having to talk about this. And ultimately, towards the end of today's forum, as we do every time we run the forum, to end up, putting out a call to action or a call of actions. I'm going to ask the various panel members to provide their views as well. But, what are the most urgent outcomes of a discussion that we will have today? Where do we need to focus? Which organizations have the biggest challenges where? And are certain entities, organizations, policymakers, decision makers, politicians, CEOs, executive managers of integrity and the likes, where do they need to put their focus, their attention in order to better manage this myriad of challenges, and also, and we should not forget this myriad of opportunities as well. Always two sides to the same coin. How sport became a business in super fast roller coaster ride of maybe 30 seconds. I always go back to 1984, the LA Olympics. Obviously 2028, they go to LA again. But the LA Olympics were what I would call initiating the first global value explosion in sport. A value explosion that was driven by the fact that the Americans showed us that the Olympic Games could actually run at a profit, that the Olympic Games could be a platform for more than just 3 weeks of supreme sport. It could be a platform for urban regeneration, for social change, for excellent performance, but also for broad community participation. But most of all, from a capitalist point of view, as a platform for new value generation. Around the 1984 Olympics, we could see enormous spikes, extrapolating trend lines in terms of media value of sport. And every single time a new cycle of Olympics or World Cups comes around, we think it cannot keep going, but that particular trend line is still scoping up significantly. And we call that old television. It was the first value explosion that happened. However, if that was not enough, the second value explosion, we are basically at the start of. People would maybe argue we're in the midst of it. I would argue really that we are at the start of the second, even more extreme value explosion in sport, which is driven by the digital revolution. And we have certainly contextualized today's discussion on the back of the digital revolution, because what did the digital revolution do that, analog, not online television could not? And that is simply, it not only allows reach into all corners of the world, but it also allows instant, immediate access to not only information, but also in terms of two-way or multi-way communication. Obviously instrumental from the perspective of an explosion of opportunities in betting, wagering, gambling on sport in particular. This is then combined with, and I live this on a daily basis, having 2 teenage kids, with a concerning epidemic. It's not COVID, it's not obesity, it's actually online addiction as an epidemic that spreads significantly throughout the younger generations, where they basically show genuine addictive signs and diagnoses whenever they cannot be online, cannot have their handheld devices. Something happens in the chemistry of the brain that just leads to quite concerning type of behaviors. That online addiction obviously feeds into some of the issues and regulations that we've recently seen when it comes to advertising gambling services, in particular to young people. And we hopefully will also debate that specific perspective during today's discussion. It is also the reason why the Wood Review and ultimately the establishment of Sport Integrity Australia came about. It is simply based on that increasing complexity matrix of issues that sport has to deal with when it comes to safeguarding the integrity of sport. And I would argue that wagering, as one of the many things that Sport Integrity Australia is tasked with to look after, has increasingly become one of the bigger and more urgent issues. And obviously, one of our panel members is a representative from Sport Integrity Australia. So in many ways, we look forward to talking about that specific perspective as well. So today's forum, this year's forum, is betting your bottom dollar against the odds, ? And on that matter, I would briefly like to mention, of course, Victoria University's specific collaboration with Sport Integrity Australia. By now, we probably in 5 different 3-day courses have delivered an introduction and expansion to what sport integrity actually means, and what the various components of the workspace of sport integrity officers is and can be in sport organizations in particular around Australia, and making sure that safeguarding is the highest priority when it comes to maintaining high standards in our Australian sports organizations at the community level in particular. And so Lara Hayes is one of the senior representatives of Sport Integrity Australia today with us. I'm going to introduce the rest of the panel to you now as well. But I think it is important I give quite an elaborate background to our panel members, so that you really get a sense and appreciation for their very wide and deep experience in various aspects of today's discussion. Lara is the Assistant Director of Sports Wagering and Competition Manipulation at SIA. But she started her career at the Australian Sports Commission in a research capacity, with particular focus on governance and integrity. She established the Sporting Schools Program, the local Sporting Champions Grants Program, and lead advisor for the Commission during the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sex abuse. In 2018, she was seconded to the then Sport Integrity Task Force within the Commonwealth Department of Health to develop and implement the government response to the Wood Review, and hopefully we'll have a bit of an opportunity to talk about that today as well. Ultimately, as we know, this led to the establishment of SIA. And since joining Sport Integrity Australia in 2020, Lara has been leading the development of the Australian Sports Wagering Scheme, the ratification of the Council of Europe's Mechlin Convention, and the establishment of Commonwealth game fixing offences. Having worked internationally, for example, in England and South Africa, I'm just very privileged and happy to welcome you to the panel, Lara. Thank you for being with us today. Then I would like to welcome Simon Bishop. Simon is going to represent the voice of sport in many ways today as the Executive General Manager, Governance, Risk and Integrity, and as Company Secretary of Basketball Australia. He's a member of the exec leadership team, and he oversees Basketball Australia's integrity, corporate governance, legal and risk management functions. And as a very highly experienced sport integrity practitioner, he's led the response to a large number of integrity matters that includes misconduct, prohibited betting, misuse of insider information, child safeguarding, member protection, and transgender participation in sport. He joined Basketball Australia in 2016 and then worked very closely with the National Integrity Sport Unit to develop Basketball Australia's National Integrity Framework. This framework, of course, applies across all levels of sport, from elite to grassroots, and includes a very broad range of issues that not only apply to basketball, but apply to all sports who have adopted the National Sports Integrity Framework. Prior to Basketball Australia, Simon spent 3 years with Sport and Rec Victoria, initially managing the combat sports unit and then undertaking a review of sport integrity risks within Victorian sport. Welcome, Simon. Very excited to have you on the panel as well. Then I would love to introduce an academic colleague of mine from the University of Canberra, Dr. Catherine Ordway. She's an associate professor and the Sport Integrity Research Lead at the University of Canberra and senior fellow at the University of Melbourne Law School. As a sports lawyer with degrees from the University of Adelaide and Charles Sturt University, Catherine is a member of the Asian Racing Federation Council on anti-illegal betting and related financial crime. Also on the International Cricket Council's Independent Review Board, head of the World Curling Federation Anti-Doping Hearing Panel, and a member of the Australian National Sports Tribunal. I don't know how you do it, Catherine, but that's, more than 24/7. She recently completed her term as a chair of the Badminton World Federation Vetting Panel, and also on the International Boxing Association Independent Integrity Unit. Catherine played tennis and netball growing up, fenced at varsity level, and represented the ACT in rugby union and was in the national squad for European handball. She has specialized in anti-doping policy since acting for the Australian Olympic Committee in the lead up to the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games, which included living in Norway and Qatar. And in 2019, she was awarded a PhD for protecting sports integrity, sport corruption risk management strategies. Catherine, welcome to the panel. And I just failed to mention your edited textbook on restoring trust in sport, corruption cases and solutions. But I'm sure we're going to refer to some of that content later in the discussion. Last but not least, from Sportradar, Andy Cunningham. He's the Senior Vice President for Global Partnerships Integrity Service. He joined Sportradar in 2013 and today responsible for partnerships and business development for the company's Integrity Services Department. This department supports over 200 sports governing bodies, law enforcement agencies, betting operators, and state authorities around the world to counter betting-related match fixing and other sport integrity threats through their innovative and proven bet monitoring, intelligence, investigations, and education services. A lot more than just a data company, I would say. It includes working internationally with FIFA, UEFA, the IOC, the NBA, the ICC, the NHL, World Rugby, ITF, and FIA, only to mention a few of maybe the top 10 biggest sports federations in the world. He also works extensively with partners in Australia, including Basketball Australia, Football Australia, the AFL, and NRL. With more than 2 decades experience in the field of sport integrity, and he has assisted numerous sporting partners and stakeholders around the world to protect the integrity of their competitions. He's based out of Australia, but very much internationally experienced and renowned for his advice to many sports organizations. Now, having spent half of the time that we have available introducing our panel members, but I appreciate and I believe that you would agree with me, it was important to tell you about this wide and deep experience that our panel members have before getting into our discussion. And Catherine, if you don't mind, I would love to start with you. And just for our audience, we will start with a few questions to the panel members individually, so that we can take, a slightly organization and experience specific perspective before we more generalize the questions. You can invite or rather put forward questions in the Q&A yourself at any particular time. They will come to me during our conversations. And then in, say, half an hour or so, we will start engaging audience questions into our discussion as well. But Catherine, first of all, and I already noted your academic background. Having said that, an academic eye to a lot of and very diverse range of organizations, and taking those different perspectives, where do you feel betting, gambling, wagering sits in the hierarchy of urgent matters to deal with in the context of integrity of sport? But much like in my intro, is it top of the bill, or is it an emerging issue that becomes more important? And who are the winners and losers in that in that game, in that play?
Well, thank you very much, Hans. That's a very difficult question, how to determine which integrity threats to sport are more or less important. How do you compare something like safeguarding athletes from abusive coaches and training procedures as compared with cheating at gambling? And if I just look at the betting context, the summary that you've already given us about the changes to the world in the digital environment really hit home about why this is such an important issue for us to be addressing, both here in Australia and overseas. Back in 1999, there was a recognition from the Productivity Commission that Australia has an issue with gambling. We were considered some of the worst losers in the world when it comes to gambling. And so that's quite a long time ago, and the situation has only become worse. So Australia is a bit of an aberration in the way that gambling has infiltrated and embedded itself throughout our entire community. And it was recognised in that same report that gambling harms were causing enormous issues across our community. And that has only gotten worse as we've expanded now more into sports betting. Back in 2005, it was recognised that match fixing in football was a huge issue when the German prosecutors found more than 300 matches across Europe had been fixed. So that's quite some time ago. That kick-started Australia into developing the what's known as the NOMFIS, the National Match Fixing policy, which was signed off by all the different state and federal sports ministers in 2011. So it was considered urgent then in 2011. And now we're in 2023 and it's at crisis point, because we can see there were recent ABC Four Corners program that gambling has now gone right down into community level sport and has involved junior players and so on. So the risks involved to vulnerable people, particularly vulnerable athletes, are enormous. And there's a lot that Australia has already been doing to try to combat that, but there's certainly a lot more that can be done. And I'm sure we're going to cover off on some of those issues throughout this session.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and my reference to winners and losers you made in terms of Australia's been losing when it comes to those gambling and losing money. But maybe, Simon, that's a nice intro to a question I have for you, because obviously, there's value created, value gained, value lost, and sports organizations deal with the conundrum of benefiting from some of the value created, but also having to deal with the issues that may some people lose more than others. So from that perspective, if you wouldn't mind, what do you think are the key issues that you have seen from this growth in online wagering, and then maybe specifically refer to your experience in basketball locally and maybe overseas? And you can maybe even extend that by thinking other sports, are some sports more likely to create a platform for young people to, become engaged in gambling than other sports?
Yeah, thanks, Hans. Thanks for the opportunity to be here on the panel today. I think certainly through the growth in online wagering, we've seen an increase in the risks that we have to deal with as a sporting body. Simply from an administrative perspective, put it into context, over the last 2 to 3 years since COVID, I started in my role at Basketball Australia in 2016. For the first 4 to 5 years, we had between 15 to 20 agreements with betting operators in Australia as a sports controlling body. The number was fairly stable. There was a few new entrants, a few mergers, but more or less that was the ballpark number. We're now up to over 60 agreements with betting operators, and at any given time we'll have another 2 or 3 that we're processing as new operators. So that's essentially a quadrupling, at least, of the workload, purely from an administrative perspective, at any given time, just to administer the agreements that we need to enter with the domestic wagering bodies. I could put someone on tomorrow full time, and they'd have a job purely to administer the wagering agreements. And that's time and effort we could otherwise be spending on education, prevention, safeguarding children, that we're having to invest into administering the regulatory requirements and the challenges that come with being a sports controlling body and wagering. In terms of, I think, a recent evolution is probably around the socialization of gambling, and in particular the evolution of the gambling apps into social media platforms. I think we're seeing that become a trend, and functionality like bet with mates has been an issue that we've confronted. That's led to an increase in the number of betting rule breaches that we've identified, whereby people enter into these groups with their friends, and then one of their friends will place the bet on basketball, which is a breach of our rules, and then we have to obviously deal with that. So I think there are challenges associated with that, and obviously that creates additional work and again resource intensive to identify and deal with it, particularly with the number of operators that we now have to go through with information requests to identify that sort of conduct. So that's something that I think will be an ongoing challenge, and I think is an emerging issue in the industry as to how that evolves and what additional challenges may come through with that. I think, as you mentioned, Hans, earlier, with the next generation and their reliance on mobile phones and technology, and with betting becoming part of that, I think there's going to be an increase in risk associated with those younger participants as they come through the sport, and making sure that we have adequate education and safeguards in place to protect them and ensure they understand the rules, and that we're able to be able to protect the athletes and other participants coming into the sport. Another area that we've seen is probably the difference between the domestic regulatory landscape and the international. So domestic obviously is fairly highly regulated. We have control over essentially what betting markets arise on Australian basketball. So we can set the contingencies, we can restrict the contingencies as we see appropriate. But offshore, we obviously have less visibility. But one of the things that we've seen is companies coming in and offering products to local clubs, associations, leagues in kind for international betting rights, and that's currently unregulated in Australia. So we could go and sell data rights to international gambling companies to junior basketball in Australia, and there's nothing that would prevent us from doing that. We obviously can't authorise those markets domestically, but I think that's a current gap and challenge in the landscape, because I think down the chain of sport at the more local level, people aren't necessarily as attuned and aware of the risks and how international gambling operates as we might be at the NSO level. Another issue that's really prominent at the moment is the abuse that athletes and other participants receive. We deal with issues weekly in relation to abuse of athletes, and Andy and his team at Sportradar assist us with investigating some of these as well. But some of the stuff that comes through, and most of the time it is related to disgruntled gamblers who've lost some money on an outcome, feel like it's their right to send anything awful to athletes or coaches or referees who are just participating in the sport. So that's becoming a prominent issue as well, and the ability that we have to protect our athletes in that space is something that is an ongoing concern for us, and I know many other sports as well. In terms of the attractiveness of betting products and those participants that are vulnerable, I think ultimately all sports that have an interest the betting companies and the punters will find a way to make it worthwhile. Some sports are certainly, I think, more conducive, basketball being one of those. It's always had a big focus on stats, which obviously creates opportunities for betting and engages people in the products. Naturally, more people are likely to bet on that type of sport, but I certainly think as it evolves, any sport where there's interest, people will find a way to bet on it. And I think, and I think that'll be something that we'll always have to continue to look at to make sure that we understand how that's evolving and what the associated risks are.
Great, thank you. And we'll come back to, we all can come back to the question, is it more an opportunity than a threat for sport, or is it actually, I hear in some of your comments that, it's a pain in the backside in terms of dealing with all the issues, the regulations, the complexities, rather than something that creates value for the sport. So, but I'll park that for now. We'll come back to that a little bit later in the more across the issues kind of discussion. I just want to go to maybe the other side of the fence, almost like the service provider to many sports organizations, rather than the issues within one organization. And I already noted Sportradar may be perceived as a data company, but in many ways it's probably a company where it is a service provider of integrity services and to sports organizations and governing bodies, and an important player, increasingly important global player in the betting industry. So from that point of view, Andy, maybe focus on Australian sports organizations and stakeholders first, and the integrity issues and challenges and risks posed by sport betting in the Australian context. What measures do you feel across all those different organizations that you advise can be put in place? Are they putting in place? And how specifically is an organization like Sportradar a player in that? How do they help as an integrity service provider?
Again, thank you for inviting me to be here today. To tackle those questions one by one, I guess, in terms of how we see from our work and from my experience, the sports and other stakeholders in Australia are tackling the challenges posed by sports betting first. I mean, the short answer is, this has been alluded to, and as Simon said, there's an awful lot going on daily, which maybe people don't realise, to protect the integrity Australian sport. You know, I've been fortunate enough to work in many countries, many jurisdictions with many stakeholders around the world, and you know, Australia is amongst the most proactive, if not the most proactive country in the world. Now, as Catherine alluded to, that's not to say it's perfect and there isn't work that can be done and things that can be enhanced, as Simon alluded to as well. But certainly the general work and infrastructure here, there's a lot of it going on daily, and it's all underpinned by collaboration and information sharing between the stakeholders, again, which you know isn't perfect, but it's certainly there, and certainly being looked at to improve, as I'm sure Lara will refer to. And the very fact that Australia and the government has invested, you know, significant resource in such a well funded and sized unit as Sport Integrity Australia, again, is something that you know is not unique, but certainly puts Australia in a very good place, you know, to tackle these threats. And you know, I know Lara and Sport Integrity Australia have done a lot of work in understanding and researching the risks from sports betting, both from domestic and international operators, to understand the level of betting on each and every sport, the level within each and every sport that is bet on, and then to help, you know, advise the sports and the sports themselves. And Simon obviously alluded to this, you know, again, generally installing all the latest measures, if you look globally, and tools and sort of resources to be across this issue and tackle it, from having strong relationships with the betting industry, to having bet monitoring, to having robust education programs, to having investigative and intelligence capabilities when needed. You know, generally, you know, the sports here in Australia sort of, you know, have that ready. And of course, law enforcement here, I think, have shown that they will also, you know, take this issue very seriously, investigate it, prosecute it in the cases that have come to fruition, particularly obviously in Victoria and New South Wales with the police there and the investigations and prosecutions that they have run. So certainly there's a lot going on. And then, you know, specifically at Sportradar, what we're doing on the integrity services side to support stakeholders here broadly, break it down into 3 buckets. The bet monitoring, so that's using advanced technology that we have as a company, from being a service provider to the betting industry to monitor betting patterns, using increasingly AI to monitor billions of data sets a week. We monitor over 10,000 matches yearly for our partners here in Australia to identify signs of suspicious activity and report it. We do a lot of work in the education space, you know, designing, implementing, helping our partners roll out education, whether in person or online. And as Simon alluded to, we also do a lot of work in the intelligence and investigation space now. So across not just sports betting integrity, but any integrity threat or issue, we help our partners investigate if there is an issue, but also increasingly importantly, carry out preventative intelligence and risk mitigation to get ahead of the game. For example, background checking and vetting. So yeah, really that's a picture. And I guess just specifically the risks as we see it to Australian sport. Now, of course, they're there wherever there's sports wagering, but just to give an insight into our kind of global statistics and metrics from working all around the world. You know, last year we reported just over 1,200 sporting events as suspicious, in our expert opinion, to our partners. 0 of those were in Australia, and that's carried on this year. I mean, there's been a handful of instances that we've seen in previous years, and of course, there's been a handful of instances that law enforcement here have investigated. But just to put in perspective, you know, we would rank Australia from that perspective as very low when you look globally. That's not to say, of course, that there isn't risk, but yeah, generally, I think part of the strong measures and proactiveness here helps guard against the threat, and you know, really acts as a deterrent. You know, we've seen specific intelligence where match fixers in certain sports have stayed away from Australia because they know there's a significant chance of them getting caught. So yeah, of course, there are risks wherever there's sports betting, but generally, from our day-to-day work of, you know, analysing betting patterns, betting levels, day in, day out, the risks are there. But on the global scale, low. But you know, of course, everyone needs to remain vigilant and on their guard.
And just out of interest, if Australia is 0, what's the top scoring nation with you know?
Last year there was one country that had over 120 matches, particularly in football, in their jurisdiction. Just to, I guess, give some context. And we're not covering everything, on monitoring everything, of course, but that's just from the work that we do.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Lara, last but not least, the organization that is a world first in the world, and for that you receive a lot of attention from overseas in terms of how Sport Integrity Australia conducts its business. It also allows you to be at the forefront of development of you know, ways of dealing with some of these issues. Can you talk a little bit more about the role of SIA in regard to wagering specifically, and you know, with reference to the Wood Review, with reference to the Mechlin Convention, and then, you know, we may down the line explore some of those issues a bit deeper, but you know.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, and thanks, Hans, for having me here today. As you mentioned, Sport Integrity Australia was one of the key recommendations of the Wood Review, which was a response to an investigation into a review of Australia's sport integrity arrangements back in 2018. The establishment of Sport Integrity Australia was a key measure of that, and that was to consolidate and bring to a national level all of the sport integrity elements of various Commonwealth agencies, including the National Sport Integrity Unit, which you've mentioned, ASADA, and also the sport integrity elements from the Australian Sports Commission. In addition to that measure, the Wood Review also proposed 3 specific wagering measures: the establishment of an Australian sports wagering scheme, which is looking at reframing the way that sports wagering is regulated and legislated within Australia. As you'd be aware, currently sports wagering is regulated at a state and territory level, and there is quite a patchwork approach to the way that each jurisdiction approaches the way that they regulate and license sports wagering within their jurisdiction. The ratification of the Mechlin Convention, I think you've also spoken about, that's a Council of Europe convention to combat competition manipulation within sports, and we are a signatory to the convention. Sport Integrity Australia works very closely with a number of other Commonwealth agencies to proceed to the ratification process of that convention. Australia, as I think many people have already suggested, it has a really strong and robust integrity and regulatory framework here. And so the threshold for us to be able to ratify the Mechlin Convention is very high. And as I said, given that a number of, all of the states and territories have a role to play in the way that wagering is regulated here, we need to ensure that all the states and territories are compliant with the articles of the convention in order for us to proceed to ratification. So working with our state and territory partners, also at a Commonwealth level, to proceed with that ratification process. The third initiative that I mentioned was the establishment of national sport integrity offences. Currently, some jurisdictions have sport integrity offences that are specific to sport outcomes. Others have offences that are hidden within bribery or fraud offences. The Wood Review suggested that having a harmonised approach to sport integrity offences would benefit, would address that patchwork approach to the way that law enforcement agencies can prosecute or investigate convictions around sport integrity or breaches. So we're working with our counterparts across government, including the Attorney General's Department, the Commonwealth Department of Public Prosecutions, to draft those offences, and hopefully over the course of the next 6 months we'll be able to be in a position to be able to release those offences as an exposure draft, just to make sure that they are fit for purpose and we're not capturing activities that can be dealt with within the rules of the sport. All of those measures are really designed to protect sport integrity within Australia. We really want to address that patchwork approach, and also for Sport Integrity Australia as the Commonwealth agency to set the policy settings to enable organisations like Basketball Australia to be able to understand the risk profile for their sport, and then to be able to put in place mitigating policies, procedures to be able to address the risks specific to that sport. And that's where Andy's work becomes really important for us, and also understanding, all the lights have just come in here, understanding the risks domestically but also internationally, so we can work through that context and work with sports domestically to make sure that they understand the risks, they can combat those risks, and their competitions are free from sports betting related corruption and competition manipulation. In addition to those three measures, the agency has a really strong focus on developing policies. As you said, the remit of the agency is broader than just sports wagering. It does pick up child protection, member protection, and also anti-doping. So through the National Integrity Framework, sports develop their own sport-specific policies to address those different areas. And then we work with sports to ensure that they understand their risk profile and can put in place measures to combat the risks associated with their sports. And as mentioned by everyone here, the agency has a really strong education focus. We really want to prevent competition manipulation, sports betting related corruption happening before it does happen. And so we want to work with agencies and individuals to make sure that they understand the impacts for them and the risks associated with that from an individual and organisational level.
Great, thank you. Certainly a long list of things that you guys need to look after and work in a very, very complex environment. I mean, it's called Sport Integrity Australia, but really this particular issue, and probably doping is the other one, where you cannot live in a vacuum. It is very much a global issue that impacts whatever happens at the local level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think, sorry, Hans, I think that through that ratification of the Macklin Convention and being able to reach out into international partners will hold us in a really good position to understand global trends and issues and the impacts that has domestically.
Yeah. Thank you. I very purposely introduced our discussion from the perspective of value creation, and because the issue of value, I'm a professor of international sport business. Everything revolves around value in business, right? Who creates value? How is it exchanged? Where there's massive value creation, there's also issues of abuse of getting or gaining access to that value. And I think the international perspective, the legal versus illegal perspective of betting opportunities created, but also accessed, is leading to my next question. And maybe Catherine, I'll go to you first. From the perspective of community sport, because you mentioned this in your introduction, community sport being now in not only involved but abused and misused for betting opportunities that not necessarily are locally created. They may be internationally created, specifically by illegal betting activities. Can you talk to us about this exposure of community sport to betting opportunities, and in particular, if you can, refer to illegal versus legal betting opportunities?
Yes, and Simon and Lara both talked about some of the complexities and the issues that are increasingly making this a risk at community level sport. To start with, the issues that Lara touched on around our federal system that causes challenges for us in being able to strengthen our regulatory response. The Wood Review that Lara talked about from 2018, the recommendations were to ratify the Macklin Convention, as she said, and the key block to that is that we have state legislation in place which is not harmonised in accordance with the national policy that was signed off in 2011. So that already causes a challenge within Australia in that, as Lara said correctly, that we have a patchwork of laws that mean that it's very difficult for a national body to prosecute those matters or to even use the same kind of harmonised language. We can have if we get that right, we can have a beautifully regulated system inside Australia. But the challenge, as everybody has pointed out, is that we work in an international global system. And many of the people that are interested in the value of betting, in your words, Hans, making money out of this are not subject to the Australian jurisdiction, not subject to our laws, are not in the least bit interested in the protections that we have put in place for Australian athletes and to protect the integrity of sport. And it's enormously challenging, particularly where some of our sports have a legal separation between the National Sporting Organisation and the leagues, so that there's a even greater separation for them because the national sporting bodies are having to do the disciplinary and integrity work, whereas the leagues and the clubs might be having a completely different agenda. and there's a lack of transparency and information around who is owning those clubs, who the sponsors are, who owns the sponsors, what are they doing with the information, what are they doing with the data, and particularly where some of the clubs are owned by foreign nationals or parent clubs overseas. You think of different settings like football as a key example, that they may have relationships with bodies that the Australian legal and law enforcement bodies have no oversight or reach into. So the Australian sports and the information that's coming through about athlete profiles and broadcasting of particular games right down into community sport could potentially be going out into the illegal markets. That causes risks, of course, because where there's no oversight and companies like Sportradar, and there's obviously a number of different commercial operators in this space, can see an amazing amount of information in the regulated markets, but of course the illegal markets are not giving you the same visibility around transactions, and it's much more difficult to follow the money trail. So if our athletes are being contacted, and of course with the advent of social media, athletes are so much more easily able to be contacted, whether it's direct messaging through Instagram, Snapchat, WhatsApp, whatever mechanism, and those people are starting to be groomed by international gambling operators and middle people, then this is really difficult for the sports to be able to control. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but it's difficult for them to have any oversight in order to be able to protect them, which is why the other way of using the word values in this setting is around what Lara's already touched on, the education piece, which is building up the resistance to those kinds of overtures and grooming efforts, so that athletes and officials, whether it's coaches or umpires, referees and so on, understand that this is the game. People are trying to contact you, not to be your friend, not to really congratulate you on an excellent catch or a great goal or whatever it was, but to try to get some information that might assist them in a gambling context, build up a relationship so that they can start to manipulate you and impact on our sports. So this is enormously challenging for Australia, because we can, even if we get our regulatory system right here, we are part of an international system, which is why both Andy and Lara talked about the importance of the international cooperation between the various stakeholders, and that's only increasingly going to be important going forward.
Yeah, thank you. Lara, you want to...
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment if I could. One of the other pieces of work that our team does is to develop position papers around emerging trends that are related to sports wagering and competition manipulation. And one of the things that we've been working on recently is a beneficial investment paper, which is around foreign investment or ownership of clubs and sports within Australia. Not all clubs allow foreign investment. There are some, or sports allow foreign investment, but we know that through the Southern Stars examples, that is a vulnerability. We know that when sports perhaps don't have huge income streams and they're looking for investment, that this is an attractive proposition for them, but it also comes with risk. So part of our work here is to work with sports so that they understand the risk attached to this beneficial investment or foreign investment to Australian sporting competitions and clubs and organisations. It is tricky, I think, because it can infiltrate down to that sort of sub-elite level. We've had examples of that within football in a number of jurisdictions in Australia, where we've had some intelligence alerts to suggest that there are foreign actors wanting to apply or adopt have a similar approach to the Southern Stars, where they have coaches and bring in their athletes, and then they can use them to benefit through betting-related corruption or to manipulate competitions for a betting outcome. So that's just something that we are mindful of. It's an emerging issue, but something I think that will have significant impact on sport domestically if we don't keep on top of it.
Yeah. Andy, in terms of your reach, if we talk about, monitoring legal and illegal environments, how deep does your reach go into community sport? In other words, the top line competitions are probably inverted commas, easier to monitor. But how deep does your ability to get to the community level go?
Yeah, it's a good question, Hans. I mean, firstly, define illegal betting. I think as it's been referred to, it's a very complex issue around the world. You know, different jurisdictions define it in different ways. There's well-regulated operators here in Australia who, under definitions used by some entities with their operations overseas and where they're licensed are illegal overseas. So that just shows the complexity. But from our perspective, you know, we look at if it's possible to monitor, if it's visible, whether it's, yeah, we tend to classify into well-regulated, not so well-regulated, or unregulated. And it's obviously easier to monitor the well-regulated. You can still monitor the not so well-regulated and sometimes the unregulated. As Catherine alluded to, there's certain things you just can't see. The cricket markets in the Indian subcontinent underground there are an example. We do have some inroads into those just through sources we've cultivated and intelligence, but you can't see what you can't see. So our monitoring, you know, we try to see as much as possibly can be seen, and whatever level there is betting on, and we can see there is betting on, you know, we will monitor. So that includes lower levels of sport where there is a significant enough offering for it to be monitored, which in Australia, from our experience of being a company who both serves the betting industry and then we also use our capabilities for integrity, it's really only football that has betting to lower levels that would, you know, has an international interest and demand significant enough to have a level of betting on a regular enough occurrence to potentially attract match fixtures, which we saw happen with the case that Lara referred to of Southern Stars. But yeah, obviously the authorities and the football authorities, Football Australia here, are very much aware of that, and you know, do all they can to monitor it, with working with us and others in the industry.
Yeah. And Simon, just as an extended question, but then specific to one particular sport, your connection, you know, the whole basketball ecosystem from, you know, community sport, 4 or 5 year olds playing at Melbourne Sports and Aquatic Centre, all the way to those playing professional in the NBL. I guess the separate entities that operate those different parts of the ecosystem, and how you as a risk and integrity manager may navigate the information that you require to cover all those different levels. Is the question complex enough for you to dissect?
Yeah, it's obviously there's different considerations at different levels, and I think for us there's probably three tiers of sports. So there's the elite professional level, which is your international teams, NBL and WNBL. Then there's the semi-professional, which is your second tier NBL 1 competition, and then there's your community basketball. Now, some of that community basketball is taken much more seriously than others, and you get right down to junior levels. I think one of the challenges is associated with, you know, generally the evolution of digital technology and the desire of participants and sporting bodies to create ongoing engagement with the competitions. So, for example, I remember when I was a kid and you had to wait to the paper the next day to see the scores of the other games in your competition and to see what the ladder was. And my 7-year-old's just started playing under 10s, and I can watch his scores in real time and see how many points he's got, how many fouls he's got, and every other game in his competition. Now, that's publicly available to anyone, and as those here will know, and many people listening in will know, that, you know, as soon as you have a live stats feed, you can frame a gambling market. So as you get towards those higher levels and even some junior levels, there's nothing that can prevent an offshore operator from starting to offer markets on any of those competitions. And I remember a long time ago when I was working at Sport and Rec Victoria, when I first met Andy way back when, and they did some work for us. We identified, you know, betting on Tuesday night social basketball leagues in Melbourne through that process, and the opportunity for international wagering operators, reputable or not, to start offering those sorts of markets is there, because more and more we are offering and making available real-time match data to a greater and greater level of detail to the general public, and that's great for sport consumption and great for engagement of the local communities, but I think we do need to be conscious that there is an associated risk there. And I think that's where it's challenging at the moment to fully understand, and then also just to make people aware that once we do this, yes, it may not seem real, it may not seem plausible, but you don't have to go far on the international gambling websites to find betting on under 14 sports internationally, and to think that they wouldn't offer under 14s in Australia if that was available and there was a reliable data source, I think we'd be kidding ourselves to a degree. So I think that's the sort of area that we need to be conscious of as a collective, to understand that the things we do here may have broader reach, broader impacts, and they may not necessarily be the targets of match fixing. But as I said before, we get lots of abuse and the names aren't necessarily hidden. You can de-identify yourself, but that 13-year-old who's playing in under 14s misses a shot that happened to be open for gambling, and all of a sudden someone from overseas finds their social media accounts and sends them some abuse. They're the sorts of things that may seem fanciful, but I don't think are too far beyond the realms of what realistically could happen in the current landscape.
Thank you. And can I just stay with you, Simon, and then go to the others, just from within the perspective of one sport. And let's stay with the concept of value creation and acknowledging that there is tremendous value created. If we just translate it to monetary value, right? So not beyond that value, let's just say that there's enormous amounts of money generated on the back of opportunities to place bets on sporting contests. Full stop. So there's value. That platform is provided by sport. By your sport, by your competitions, by what you regulate, what you invest in order to create it. So someone else invests in a platform that others then can generate significant value on. Short question, probably complex answer. Is there enough value created that comes to you as a sport, as opposed to it going to others who use your platform to create that value? And if not, can that change in the near future? And then, Andy, I'll come to you, because your business model obviously is different. You generate value on the back of value created, on the back of value created, if that makes sense. But let's first go to the sport perspective. Do you get enough out of it? And if not, can it change?
Yeah, I think the key point there is around who bears the ultimate risk attached to this. As you suggested, the sport creates the value and creates the opportunity, which others then utilize to profit. At the moment, we have the agreements with operators and can collect a fee on wagering that occurs within Australia on Australian basketball content. But there's obviously a significant amount of basketball wagering in Australia that falls outside of that. So if someone places a bet on the NBA, for example, there's no fee payable back into the sport. So I think there's certainly a case to be made that when a punter places a bet on a sport, a reasonable position would be that a percentage of that, or a share of that, is invested back into the sport to develop the game, to support community level volunteers, the integrity of the sport, developing programs for participation, diversity and inclusion, all of the social good that sport can deliver. So I think there's an opportunity there to look at the funding model for sport generally, and how sport wagering, with that value you're talking about, Hans, can be utilised to actually invest more into sport. And when you look at the comparisons between how much of the value gets invested back into racing versus sport, and with the growth in sports wagering and the risks that are coming along with that, I think there is an opportunity to consider and make sure that sports are getting a sufficient return on that, to manage the risk initially, but also to acknowledge that it is the sport that is generating that opportunity.
Yeah, and I guess you kind of referred to the fact that for some sports it's life or death. Having the opportunity to bet. The Spring Carnival is just coming to a close. Whereas in other sports, the real focus of the federation is to create different types of value, where it might be a nice to have, but sometimes also a very complex, not wanting to have kind of headache of regulation and and policing it. So Andy, on that, because as a service provider, the business model for Sportradar is quite different. You not necessarily derive your primary value from the actual betting activity, but you know, by the betting activity existing that you have created a business model on. How does that sit, you know, in comparison to maybe helping sports organizations to generate maximum value out of it?
Yeah, so a large part of the work that Sportradar does around the world is partnering with organizations directly as well, to help them monetize their data for betting, if there's demand for it. And you know, increasingly in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, you've seen sports sort of recognize that the betting is there and it's not going to go away, or it can't be stopped if they did want it to be stopped. So you know, they choose to partake in that value chain and that money chain by, you know, creating official betting feeds, for example, partnering with companies like Sportradar and others in that field. And then through that, you can, you know, also partake in, you know, commercially from international betting, where, you know, if the sport, now it doesn't apply to all sports, of course, if the sport is of interest to international bettors. So, you know, and you can also, you know, pass on integrity terms. And we see this in some of the sports we work with here in Australia, where there is an international demand for their product. They have an official feed that is sold to, you know, international bookmakers around the world, and as part of the terms to get access to that information data, those international operators, and sometimes some of them what might be deemed as, you know, not so well regulated, are, you know, have to agree to share information for integrity reasons, and they do. I've seen it firsthand. Now, of course, it's not that, you know, they can't be put under the same controls and regulation as, you know, domestic operators in a market, but you know, there is ways to commercially partake, but also be, you know, also get some control and oversight and insight into betting internationally through those mechanisms as well.
Thank you. And Catherine, more an objective point of view, I guess, as an academic observer and investigator, more harm than benefit, or a balance between harm and benefit, a balance between risk and reward? Any views on that?
Yeah, I think that there are some really important issues that have been raised here. The first is, if you think about the elite and professional level of the sport, the national sporting bodies, AFL, NRL, cricket, those kinds of big sports are getting a benefit, but the benefit is per bet. And so what we've seen is that they actually derive revenue per bet placed, and the more exotic the bets, the higher the amount raised back to the sport. And yes, that has a benefit, as Simon said, that can fund integrity units, that can pay for Sportradar and other bodies to do integrity work. But do we want that? So the key question in terms of balance is, where do we draw the line? The example that Simon gave of being able to see real-time live stats on his under-10 competition, his son's under-10 competition, I think is really concerning. Do parents understand that by having the benefit of being able to look at the live stats while they're traveling or at home while their child is playing, mean that their child is then exposed to potentially international illegal betting operators, or through a grooming and match fixing perspective at worst case scenario, but even least of which, as Simon mentioned, the cyberbullying aspect, which is enormously concerning and increasing. So do we think that that's a reasonable offering to make to parents and consumers of the sport? Where do we draw the line? And I know that Tennis Australia has done a lot of work in this space because of the huge issues in tennis, and the International Tennis Integrity Body has recommended that particularly low-level competitions that are only earning small amounts of prize money shouldn't be broadcast and shouldn't have that live data available to betting operators. And Tennis Australia has actually gone further than the recommendations at the international level in that they've set a higher bar for when those matches can be broadcast. But I'm wondering whether all the sports have been thinking about this in a way that really protects their athletes and protects their sports, rather than focusing purely on what money can be made. Because as both Andy and Simon mentioned, when people are betting from overseas on Australian product, or Australians are excited about the sport but then betting on international competitions, then the money isn't coming back to Australia, but it may still expose Australian sport into a negative way. So on balance at the moment, I think that we've gone too far as a nation. Has the horse already bolted? Maybe it's too difficult to bring it back in, but I think we do need to have these conversations about what it is that we want as a community and how far we're prepared to go for $1.
And Lara, on that, do you see SIA, or does SIA see itself purely as a, call it mediator or regulator or policy maker, or does the perspective of how can we maximize benefits and value created for sport as an offshoot of, you know, the integrity unit that formerly was with the Sports Commission, for example? You know, do I make sense? Is it a very technical process for SIA in as a policy maker and mediator, educator, or is it also a responsibility role that you have in terms of maximizing the value on behalf of Australian sport?
Yeah, I think there's a few things there to comment on. One, we aren't a regulator at the moment in this space. We're hoping to move into some sort of space through the Australian Sports Wagering Scheme. I think what's important to understand is that we will leave the commercial negotiations to a sporting organisation and use their market power to negotiate product fees that they can recruit from the wagering service providers. I think it's really important to understand that we need a strong domestic wagering environment to ensure that people stay on shore and that our wagering service providers are competitive on price and product. Otherwise, we risk people going offshore, and that's something that none of us want to see. I think also that some of the things that Catherine mentioned too about betting on underage competitions and things like that wouldn't be allowed domestically, and I'll defer to Simon on this because sport controlling bodies have the overarching responsibility and approval for those contingencies that can be set. So I think that when we talk about this monetising, the risk potentially is offshore, and how we mitigate that, how we address that is something that is really difficult and complex. I'm hoping that through the ratification of the Macklin Convention and the establishment of the national platforms here, we're able to influence other national platforms where there are regulated markets in place to be able to pull back if there are markets being offered on domestic Australian sports that don't have the authority from the sport controlling body to have those markets offered. But I think the challenge with this is when the offers that are marketed through a party or an unregulated provider, and that's the challenge that we have. It's a complex one. We don't have an easy solution at the moment, other than trying to engage and influence as best we can with our international partners.
Yeah, thank you. Just to the audience members, if you have specific questions that you want to direct at one of the panel members, please make sure that you include his or her name in your question. They can be submitted to the Q&A function at the Vimeo platform there. Maybe I'm going to throw one to all of you, and whomever wants to answer this first can put their hand up virtually or real, and liken betting challenges to doping, and argue that detection follows invention. That those who try to manipulate and abuse the system always, or seemingly always, seem to be 1 or 2 steps ahead of those who try to prevent things from happening. Catherine mentioned the horse may have bolted already. We've let this go too far. Regulation is not in tune with. I mean, there was reference, I think, by Andy about. You know, the infusion of artificial intelligence, not only in terms of monitoring, but also in terms of those who develop AI systems to actually stay ahead of the monitoring. A question to all of you. Are we facing the same challenge in betting regulation detection as we have done and continue to do so when it comes to performance enhancing substances, doping, etc.? Can we stay ahead of those who try to manipulate the system? They call this
maybe I'll go first.
Go, Andy.
Yeah, from our perspective, it's something we think about all the time. Of course, in our role where we're doing the bet monitoring, how can we try and stay ahead of the match fixers, continue to detect as much match fixing as we do, which to be clear is under 1% of all the matches we monitor. But of course, any match fixing is bad for sport. So, and we don't know is the answer. Like, are we catching everything that can be caught with what we're looking at? We like to think we're doing the best we can and advancing technology as quickly as we can to help us. And we do continue to detect suspicious betting, and but that is something that we're always concerned about. Are we doing all we can, seeing all we can, and not just us, others who work in this space and in this industry. I'm not sort of an expert on the doping field or have much experience there to compare, but certainly from a betting integrity perspective, we're constantly trying to innovate and stay ahead of the curve if we can. But sometimes it's hard to know if you are ahead, and we just do what we can, and continue to detect what we can, which I think we are detecting match fixing regularly as we're showing, and those numbers are increasing. But we do constantly think about new sources, new intelligence, new information that we might be able to get access to continue to try and cover and prevent risk as much as possible.
Yeah. Lara, I know that you have a specific education department in SIA. How important in the context of this is education as a, call it preparatory or preventative measure for these things to happen in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. It's essential for us, and not only for the traditional sports and those well established as Basketball Australia is and all of our other sport controlling bodies, but we're finding that our education is targeted around some emerging sports, particularly around esports and female athletes, where you have an increase in female competitions or the visibility and commercialisation of women's sport, and just the level of education, awareness and maturity and exposure, I guess, of female athletes, and also some emerging sports to these risks. So education is extremely important for us. We do a lot of targeted education with sporting organisations, as I mentioned before, at an organisational level and at an individual level. I just wanted to pick up on one of the things that Andy said, if I could, and one of the challenges that I think we have in keeping ahead of these attempts to manipulate sporting competitions and to profit from betting-related corruption. One of the things that the Wood Review proposed through the Australian Sports Wagering Scheme was the establishment of a transactional bet monitoring system domestically, where we will be able to consolidate, Sport Integrity Australia would be able to consolidate all of those transactional betting information into one spot so that we could see across all sports and all wagering service providers the type of betting patterns and behaviours that were going on domestically. At the moment, we don't have that. There is not one view of that, which I think makes it really difficult, and it goes back to that patchwork approach where you're seeing things in silos. And so it's really hard to get a really holistic view of the patterns around betting. We rely heavily on AI and machine learning to try and develop algorithms that looked at variations in betting patterns or what markets may be susceptible, what sports may be susceptible. So that's something that we think will have significant benefit to the market domestically or to the environment domestically, and something that we'll work with Simon on as part of our advisory group to try and develop a really strong platform that's got good value proposition across all industry and sports to make sure that they are equipped with that information so that they understand the threats and, again, can put in place the strategies to mitigate those risks.
Thank you. Catherine, also maybe the education component, but the broader perspective of how to get that to those who need it most.
Perhaps if I can first just go back to your question about the difference in approach between doping and match fixing, the cheating to win, cheating to lose kind of idea. in many ways, what you're saying is exactly right. That the technology is improving and expanding on both the opportunities and the threats. So there are kind of two things happening simultaneously, where the people trying to combat the cheating have availability to technology, so they are able to do a whole range of different things, whilst on the other hand, the people who are kind of in the arms race to cheat are able to do a lot on that side as well. So in that way, there's some similarity. But of course, the difference between doping and match fixing is very stark, in that if you're doping as an athlete in order to win, then you're impacting on your performance and you as an individual, and which might, of course, impact on the people who are in your race or in the competition that you're going against. But the match fixing world is vastly more enormous, and the magnitude of the impact of cheating in a match fixing setting and how it might impact people around the world is much, much larger than any one sporting organisation can deal with, because they, at very least, don't have jurisdiction over them. So one law enforcement body doesn't have jurisdiction, and even a body like Interpol would struggle to be able to manage what they're dealing with, because one of the points that you made really early on, Hans, was around the cultural attitude to this. I think one of the reasons why we saw the International Convention on Anti-Doping signed up as the quickest international convention ever signed was because the governments got on board, because it's very easy to argue that doping is bad, cheating through doping is a bad thing, and all the ministers of sport around the world could agree that that was something that we would get on board with. How governments feel about gambling and the impacts in the community are very mixed internationally. So that's another really big challenge for us, because in the Australian context, we can say, well, gambling is kind of the right of an adult to choose whether they're going to get involved in gambling. It's a legal activity, even though we can recognise that there are harms to the individual, harms to the community. We can manage that. We can have a regulatory system. Some communities around the world will say, no, there's to be no gambling, particularly no sport gambling, and we won't allow it. Therefore, we have no visibility about what's happening. So there's no internationally harmonised approach to how we're going to tackle gambling first and then match fixing second. And I think that's one of the big differences, apart from the technology and digital differences that you've already pointed out, and makes it really challenging for regulators like Sport Integrity Australia.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to make a quick switch to some of the audience questions that are coming in, because as it always goes, time flies by when you have fun. Simon, I may direct this one to you first, but again, it's one for all of you to consider. We have a beautiful one of the big streaming platforms in Australia is My Sport Live, which focuses on sports that are not tier 1 or tier 2 sports, and all the way to the community level. I was overseas and I saw my daughter's grand final on My Sport Live, which was amazing because they won it by 1 point. But it's an amazing service if indeed it is being used for the purpose that it's been put in place. Chris from Sports Cover is asking this question: is live streaming part of the issue in terms of having access to community sport with or without the stats? And then a related question or follow-up question to that from Chris is, should we work harder to geolocate viewers? Do you have a view on that, Simon?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily use the term issue, but I think it is something that we do need to be cognizant of the risk that is created when we start to stream sport, because it does create that opportunity. As soon as there's a reliable feed, whether that's the data or whether that's the vision, it enables someone to frame a betting market. Now, if it's a one-off game, if it's lower community level, it's less likely. But if it's a regular structured competition, if it's in the right time slot, if it's in the right time zone, it's a gap in the market, internationally, these operators will look for an opportunity and they'll look for content to fill the gap. So if you're a basketball bettor and you want to bet and you're a professional punter or you're overseas and you want to continually bet 24/7, the operators need to have something available. So that's where I think we just need to be aware of what those risks are. And if you are looking at live streaming or having real-time stats available, to understand those risks and keep an eye out. And you can work with companies like Sportradar who can have a look and they can monitor some of those offshore betting sites and give you a pretty good answer as to whether or not there's any markets offering. And we've done that with Andy and his team before, where we've asked them to have a look at certain competitions or certain events to say, you know, can you identify whether there's any offshore wagering on this competition? And that can give you some peace of mind, because we don't want to get to the point where we're, you know, preventing people from engaging with the sport, because it's really important in this day and age, as you said, to watch your daughter participate, win a grand final. Fantastic. If you didn't have that stream, if it wasn't live, then it probably wouldn't be recorded and you wouldn't be able to celebrate and enjoy that moment. So I think it's just about being cognizant of what that risk is and understanding that there are steps you can take to mitigate and manage that risk. But I think if we're just, I guess, put our heads in the sand and assume that it won't happen because it wouldn't happen here, then I think we have to just be aware that, the way people operate in other jurisdictions isn't necessarily the same way we operate domestically.
Yeah. Any others want to comment on the streaming?
Yeah, I'll just add on that, hand, because actually we've been working with a sport here in Australia actually very recently, looking at this exact issue where actually Sportradar has the technology and helps them provide streams on some community level sports, and looking at the different measures that can be put in place to mitigate the risk of it being used by overseas betting operators. It includes things like geolocation. That is exactly something that's being looked at. Obviously, there's potentially ways around that, of course, but you know, still better to put that in. They're not so using platforms that will restrict it to Australia, or obviously you can then control through the system here what markets operators can offer. There's increasing a delay on the stream to a level that should disincentivize bookmakers from being more confident in framing markets. But you then have exactly what's been alluded to earlier, also to consider, as Simon mentioned, the data feed. If you increase the streaming, but there's still actual data scoring that's much quicker and to a deep enough extent that can be used to frame markets, you have to balance the two. And then the ongoing monitoring to understand, with those measures you put in place, to check if there is, or if you can see if there is betting markets being framed. So it's definitely something that sports are increasingly becoming aware of here in Australia.
Yeah. Catherine, I want to throw another question from the audience to you, from Gemma, who notes that there's a lot of attention that we currently place on the impact on kids from online gambling, ads in particular, and exposure to opportunities to gamble. But is there actually any evidence that suggests this leads to problem gambling or increased, involvement in gambling?
Well, I think it's early days for us to be able to determine that, but there is some evidence already, and some of the work that's being done out of University of Sydney and other jurisdictions in Nevada and so on, where they've seen that the amount of gambling and the normalization and socialization of gambling is having an impact on young people. So I could say anecdotally, in my own class of sports management students, when I ask them how many of them have sports gambling or betting apps and profiles, then pretty much all of the men in the class will say yes, put up their hand. None of the women. tends to be the profile. The young women in the class say they don't want to flush their money down the toilet, which is an interesting perspective. And that the men will say in my class that they want to have skin in the game, and that they can't watch an AFL game, a basketball game, and a rugby union game without having even if it's a $5 bet, because they think that that's more fun. And as we've talked about before, that kind of betting with your mates type products is adding to that, where it's seen as a social way of being able to watch sport now. So there's increasingly work done in the area. It's not my area to look at that, but there are people that are looking at it. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, Lara, then an extension question here that you may want to tackle first, but again, open to the others as well. This is from Kev. Interested to hear any of the panelists' views on SBS's recent announcement that it is introducing controls for viewers to avoid gambling ads. Will this move the needle on the issue?
I don't know if it'll move the needle on the issue. I think that it's probably prudent and more interesting that SBS have done that. I just would note that there has been a recent House of Representatives inquiry looking at the harms of online gambling, and there is work underway with the Department of Social Services and Department of Communications to address these issues and make sure that broadcast advertising is commensurate with community expectation. Again, it's not our bag here at Sport Integrity Australia. I wasn't aware of that SBS approach, but interesting that they've done that. Yeah, it's something that we'll watch. And I think from our perspective, harm minimisation and sport integrity outcomes, there are links to certain degrees, but we very much will stay in our lane of sport integrity outcomes.
Others have views on this? Okay. I would like to move to some kind of conclusion to our discussion, but make it a very actionable conclusion and invite each and every one of you, maybe based from parts of the discussion insights, but also your personal point of view, your experience, your role that you play in the sport ecosystem from this particular perspective, a call to action. If you were to identify maybe a direction, a position, an issue that requires a call to action, can be positive, negative, regulatory, behavioral, whatever. What would that call to action be? Where would you start that call to action from? Who would you direct it to? Simon, I'm going to put you up first.
Sure, thanks, Hans. Well, I think with Lara on the call, I think getting towards a national sports wagering scheme will be a really important development from a sports perspective to create some consistency around the regulatory landscape. And I think as part of that, as I mentioned earlier, to make sure that we have the aligned systems and processes and capacity within sport in particular to manage the risks. I think what we've seen, generally speaking, globally in relation to match fixing and gambling related risks in sport, it's been the sporting organisations who've been the most effective at coming up with disciplinary sanctions. We've seen a number of criminal legal proceedings not go very far or end up with quite lenient penalties, suspended sentences or small monetary fines, whereas sports are able to really hit people in this context where it hurts by banning them for life or for extended periods from the sport. So I think we need to ensure that the money is being invested into the sports who actually do have that capacity with the right systems and right processes to really enforce the rules and actually to detect the behaviour, because I think sports are well positioned in partnership with organisations like Andes and Sport Radar, through government and law enforcement to really have the most impactful benefit, as well as to ensure the prevention and education, which we can invest in as well. And I think, again, having those systems within the sports is really important and has, I think, been proven to be the most effective measure to manage these risks.
So your call to action is directed at Sports Integrity Australia. So let's move to Sport Integrity Australia then. And Lara, what's your call to action?
Probably exactly that, to progress those two measures that I spoke about earlier. We're very committed to those measures. We think that they're going to have extremely significant benefit domestically, but also internationally, with the way that we understand the risks and threats associated with sports wagering. I think it's also just I'd like to be mindful that when we talk about sports betting and sports gambling, there is a context around that. We have a really strong domestic regulatory framework here in Australia. I also know that sports betting is such a small percentage of broader gambling. And so I think it's important to just remain within that context. there are other risks out there that perhaps we just need to be mindful of. So hopefully a pragmatic approach to the way that we handle the sport integrity risks. And as I mentioned, with some of the things going on with other agencies working on various elements around sports wagering and sports gambling, I think that having that context becomes really important.
Maybe a quick follow-up then on that, given that sport in the bigger picture is small compared to the overall industry, do you feel that there may not be sufficient attention paid for less visible platforms like sport in terms of money being spent on gambling related matters?
Potentially. I mean, I don't have access or visibility of how much money is spent on other gambling measures and things like that. I think that I guess the challenge that we have, the sport has, is around advertising and the conflation of the advertising with the actual percentage of betting that's taken on within sport integrity, within sport. So I think that it's just, I guess, something that I feel strongly about, because we have a lot of conversations with people and things get quite taken out of context. So I'd just like there to be some sort of acknowledgement, I guess, of the context within which we're working is quite a small percentage of the overall gambling environment domestically.
Yep. Andy, your call to action.
I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I had honestly jotted down one of two things. One of them was the benefits that the wagering scheme will bring to have consistent sort of regulation across the board, and particularly around allowing real-time free-flowing information sharing across sports and jurisdictions. We've seen one or two examples over our years working with different stakeholders where there's entities looking at the same groups of individuals, but they're not aware. We can maybe try and point that out. There's obviously data protection and regulatory barriers to that. It shouldn't be the case that someone like ourselves ideally shouldn't be the one pointing that out. And the other thing I noted down was just sort of education from, it's been touched on today from our perspective, just from what we see and working with different sports, just making sure, is it the case that every athlete or stakeholder whose competitions are bet on has received and is receiving, suitable levels of awareness education within sport in Australia? I know there's a lot of work going on there, but again, certainly seen one or two examples where there's still a few gaps. But yeah, that would be it from my side.
Thank you very much. Catherine, last but not least, you started us off. Maybe you can give us a call to action finish.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all of those calls to action and add to that by saying that Australia has been seen as the leading country in this space in terms of sports integrity for a long time, but I think we're lagging behind. When the Wood Review came out in 2018 and the top recommendations were to ratify the Macklin Convention and to get nationally consistent legislation, and we haven't managed to do that in 5 years, that makes me wonder whether the state's sports ministers and ministers for racing and however called are not fully cognizant of the risks and the need to work in a harmonised manner. I appreciate that even if we had national legislation, we're still going to need state legislation, but at the moment we don't have state legislation that is in accordance with the national policy from 2011, and that's really problematic. If we want to be a best practice nation and to set an example for other countries around the world, and I think we need to do that in order to strengthen and lift all the work that's being done in this space, then we really need to focus on that. And I know that's top of Lara's list. That's not a criticism of Sport Integrity Australia, but I just think that perhaps the state bodies are not seeing this as the urgent risk that it really is.
Thank you very much. And that I like the fact that we're not going on 4 different tangents here with call to action, because it does say that in many ways our discussion today also has hopefully highlighted with the input from our audience as well. Thank you very much for that, by the way, that we kind of converge to a collective opinion that the system itself is quite fractured, fragmented, that there's different ways, even within a small system, relatively small system, such as the Australian sporting system, of either lack of legislation or lack of alignment of legislation. Certainly not a platform at this stage for a truly national approach to it. You know, as you just mentioned, Catherine, get, you know, the states in order first before we actually can move to a national level. Integration, system integration, so different stakeholders actually speaking to each other and sharing information, having a common platform of consistent and valid information that is shared across. And then, you know, context obviously is important. We did quite elaborately spoke about the fact that, you know, the Australian ecosystem sits in a global system that has no boundaries in many ways, and is further complicated by cultural difference, the people who view the same issue from a different perspective, and mentioned many times and also highlighted in some of the discussions. We can try to fix things, but to fix things is also a preemptive approach to fixing things is actually informing and educating and making people aware of things, so that we don't actually have to fix things, or less focus on fixing things if we can prevent them from happening. So the importance of education. I can promise to you and to our audience that on the back of this discussion, the recordings and the transcripts of this particular session, we will come up with a summary of our findings of the call to action that will be distributed to all of those of you who were online today, and of course to all of you who will view this as a recording. Please contact us at the various email addresses that the university has open to you, or indeed what will be posted on the website for information. Leaves me, and like we said before, this will go in a flash. You know, we will have so much to talk about. We are very close to 5 o'clock. It leaves me to thank all of you for your contribution. I'll come back to the panel in a minute, but I first would like to thank SportsCover, Chris Nash in particular, Cheryl McCormack and Anton Milne from SportsCover for their ongoing support of the National Sports Integrity Forum, the team from Victoria University, Angela, Linda, Jasmine and Claudia, thank you very much for all the hard work behind the scenes, during, and now, you know, we do post-production as well. The team at MSL Production, My Sports Live, as the platform that brought this to you, and as the platform that brings many sporting events to you throughout the week. Lastly, for those of you with staff who could benefit from further studies, I also would like to advertise the fact that at Victoria University we have a graduate certificate in sport integrity, and also highlight again our beautiful cooperation and collaboration with Sport Integrity Australia. Leaves me to thank my amazing panel members. It was an absolute pleasure having you, and an absolute pleasure to engage with you in a discussion about this very important topic. Lara Hayes, Simon Bishop, Andy Cunningham, and Catherine Ordway, thank you very, very much for your participation and engaged contributions. I can only look forward to seeing you face to face somewhere in the beautiful sport system that is Australia. I'm thanking all of you attendees for being part of this. I hope you have a great finish to your Tuesday. Is it Tuesday? Yes, it is Tuesday. And we'll see you next year, hopefully at the 9th National Sport Integrity Forum. Thank you all very much.